Okay, so we're here in Central Florida and we're talking a lot about disturbance because it's such an important part of these systems. When I say that word to most people, they usually are thinking primarily about fire, and sometimes we include disturbances in forests like timber harvest, and then some people are thinking about disking on a tractor or mowing. Those are all types of disturbances, and those are the ones that are intuitive, and those are the tools at our disposal often that we might use. But something that I find really interesting about it, and it has really helped shape my view on habitat management and how we use tools to try to accomplish specific objectives for wildlife. A lot of those tools, we use them in ways that are very similar to natural disturbances that happen in ecosystems. So you probably immediately see that this stand behind me right here has been burned. Well, obviously, when fire was lit by lightning, for instance, that natural process is mimicked really well, and that's really intuitive to people that if we use prescribed fire, that would mimic the nature's fire pretty well. That's intuitive. But other practices are not as intuitive, I've found. For example, in this part of the world, we have major windstorms and hurricanes. And something that you see really commonly associated with those windstorms is they damage a lot of trees. They might blow them over, break them off, break a lot of limbs, and you end up with these gaps in the canopy. And oftentimes that will resemble quite a bit what it would look like after you thinned a forest, right? So those two types of disturbance, even though we're implementing one, it's mimicking something that nature does pretty well. Some other examples that you might think of, maybe a beetle spot, depending on where you're at. That often will be a small group of trees, maybe a half acre to an acre. That beetle spot kills a bunch of trees. You've punched a hole in the canopy. That might resemble really closely some of the things that we do in forest stand improvement, for instance, where we go in and selectively kill smaller patches of trees like that to increase sunlight penetration. And I think it's really valuable to think about that in your particular system. What kinds of disturbances naturally occurred in the system that structured the plant communities, and a lot of the wildlife species that you're interested in might have adaptations specifically to take advantage of those types of disturbances. Another one that we use really frequently and is pretty similar to a natural disturbance is something like disking. So you can see we've used a disc arrow here to put in a fire line, but we also talk about using that in old fields to stimulate forward production. So you might ask, well, what does that mimic? So one of the most interesting interactions that I've studied quite a bit is looking at fire and herbivory interacting. And historically, over much of the United States, we had bison. And there's been a lot of work done where we still have bison showing a pretty clear relationship between fire and herbivory. And if you've been around bison or looked, you can look up their hoof. It's actually shaped sort of like a shovel. And if you imagine there being quite a few of those, we have a burned area that attracts them. Maybe it's a prairie where you're at, or it could be, in a really open forest setting like we see in much of the South. Bison went all the way down into Central Florida based on historical records. We might have a fire, then you have bison move in, and essentially they're a bunch of, literally ton per individual poundage walking around with 4 shovels. And if there's a whole bunch of them coming in after a fire, you can imagine how that could have really disturbed the soil in a very similar way to what we do with a disc. So the reality is we had many abiotic, like lightning or wind or water, and also biotic, like the bison example I just gave. Lots of those disturbances were interacting in these systems to shape the way that they functioned. And a lot of our wildlife species have adaptations to take advantage of that. And if you start thinking about it in that context, it can start to lead you through how you decide what kind of management practice to implement to mimic those disturbances so you can meet objectives for specific wildlife species. And I think that thinking about it that way for me has really helped me to apply habitat management practices in a wide variety of contexts, because I immediately start thinking about, okay, in my system, what did it look like historically, and what do I have at my disposal now to mimic that? So I think that's a great way to think about it. It obviously becomes more problematic because the systems have changed. As you know, we don't have some of those species anymore. We also have added a bunch of species, so you might have invasive species problems that you have to deal with. So all of those things have to be taken into context when you're thinking through that strategy, but hopefully, thinking a little bit more ecologically for a moment can help you put into context why some of these tools can be applied really in unique ways in different situations to meet objectives in those systems.